And it would be even greater pleasure if it was a little less of a hubbub amongst the audience. Great pleasure to chair the meeting this evening for reasons which will become obvious a little later on. Our Society Chairman, Gabrielle, is sitting quietly in the middle of the audience, and he has been a long-term friend and colleague of Rabbi Apple, and we will ask him at the appropriate time to give a vote of thanks at the end of the meeting. I knew, of course, when Rabbi Apple began this evening that he would be able to steer us through two separate meetings, one lasting 15 minutes and a longer one which is about to start. Because anybody who's read the Torah Tidbits knows that far from needing several pages, he's able to convey ideas simply, succinctly and clearly, and that's the way in which he presented his new book to us, and we wish it every success. When I was asked to chair the meeting this evening, I checked first of all on Wikipedia, which is the source and fount of all knowledge, and discovered that Rabbi Apple does indeed have a Wikipedia entry, which was quite long, and with some modesty he handed me a CV just now, which is only half the length of Wikipedia. So I'm sure this is also an authentic version. So let me tell you that Rabbi Apple was born in Melbourne, educated there and in the UK, began his pulpit career in London, and was a senior rabbi of the Great Synagogue in Sydney for 32 years, one of Australia's highest profile public figures, speeches on national occasions, and has degrees in law, history, education and religion, and awards from 4 Australian universities. Senior Rabbi to the Australian Defence Force, member of the Sydney Bet Din, teacher at Sydney and New South Wales universities, and Master of Mandelbaum House at Sydney University. Patron of the Australian Council of Christians and Jews, and this is the interest that sparked the book which is presented to us this evening. Past Deputy Grand Master of Freemasonry in New South Wales and ACT, I presume, is the Australian Capital Territory. Past President of the Australian Jewish Historical Society, past President of the Rabbinate of Australia and New Zealand, currently President of the Rabbinical Council of America, Israel region, a researcher, historian, author, writer for academic journals and popular periodicals. His Oz Torah emails have a worldwide circulation, and we are privileged that he and his wife Marion live nearby and are frequent attenders at our meetings, as a member of our society committee, and he finishes with the important part: number of children, grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Rabbi Apple to address us on a slightly odd title, Rabbinic Eccentrics. We were not aware of such a phenomenon. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that before beginning, it will be appropriate to explain why the term eccentric applies to certain rabbis. I was asked this question by my friend and fellow Australian Greer Fay Cashman of the Jerusalem Post, to whom I said, I used to tell people in Australia, I know I'm meshuggah, but I'm not crazy. And so that is probably the best definition of a rabbinic eccentric. A bit meshuggah, but not necessarily crazy. It happens that the 4 rabbinic figures whom I'll be discussing in the course of this paper were in some respects also a little bit crazy, but this is something which you will have to judge as we go ahead. The 4 people about whom I'm going to speak are Dr., and I put the word doctor in inverted commas, Dr. Falk, the Baal Shem of London, Joseph Krull, a man of strange habits and little learning, Avraham Belais, a poet who fled to England to escape his creditors, and Hermann Hölzel, who set himself up as chief rabbi Nathan Marcus Adler's rival in the Antipodes. So these are the rabbinic eccentrics. We begin with Dr. Falk. And if I make a point of adding quotation marks before and after the word doctor, it is because there is no certainty that either he or many others who call themselves doctor in those days really had a doctorate or indeed any university qualification. I might even add that although I call these four people rabbinic eccentrics, I have my doubts as to whether at least two of them were really rabbis at all. But I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, and on that too, you can form a judgment as I go. Close to the tomb of Chief Rabbi David Teveler Schiff in the Mile End Cemetery in East London is the grave of his admirer, Samuel Jacob Chaim Falk, the reputed Baal Shem of London, who died on 17th April 1782. Falk spent many years in Britain, often on bad terms with the communal leaders. London Jews could not decide whether he was a sorcerer or a saint. Though known as an Ashkenazi, Falk was the son of Raphael HaSfaradi, Raphael the Sfaradi. His real surname may have been Laniado, a Sephardi name meaning hairy. Falk was born in Podolia, though some give his birthplace as Fürth in Bavaria. Cecil Roth, the historian, dates his birth as about 1710. Others say 1708. Falk was a Kabbalist and alchemist who arrived in England in 1742 after nearly being burnt at the stake as a sorcerer in Westphalia. Whether he really practiced magic is not known, but he was certainly banished from Cologne by the Archbishop Elector. He spent some time in Fürth, which was then a Kabbalistic center, and left its Jewish community 20 guineas in his will. Falk had a mysterious career of fame, fortune, and fable. His life took him to many places and gained him the reputation of an adventurer. He was certainly a practitioner of alchemy, which gave the public the impression that he was a wonder worker. If he was originally Laniado, he probably adopted a new name to outwit his pursuers. Falk, meaning falcon, may have come from the sign on his house. He was known as Dr. de Falk, but many people in those days called themselves doctor. He may or may not have been a rabbi. He had some, we don't know how much, Jewish knowledge, including the mystical Kabbalah. A strange document found after his death contains Kabbalistic formulas and diagrams which may have been alchemical recipes. People came to him with their problems and ailments, and he was said to achieve miraculous cures. He apparently invoked the names of the angels and placed great store on his and other people's dreams. His incantations were based on the divine name, which is why he is called a Baal Shem, but this may have been theatrics. He was believed to be able to access holy mysteries and utilize them at will. He had a private synagogue as well as a chemical laboratory. He owned several Torah scrolls and left 2 to the Great Synagogue of London. He is credited with saving the synagogue from destruction by fire by writing Hebrew letters on the door. His connection with the Great Synagogue is seen in 2 strange pieces of evidence. He left the synagogue an annual sum of £100, a vast amount in those days, and he deposited a bundle of papers with a congregational leader, Aaron Goldsmith, with instructions not to open it on pain of death. Goldsmith eventually could no longer restrain himself, opened the package, and died that same day. In London, Falk lived in Prescott Street and later Well Close Square. A neighbor was Emanuel Swedenborg, the scientist and theologian. Possibly they influenced each other's thinking. Falk was rather affluent, maybe from a lottery win, certainly from his admirers' gifts. And some said that he had treasure buried in Epping Forest. People saw him visit the forest in his carriage, but it may have been to meditate and gather herbs for his potions. It is said that once a wheel came loose from his carriage in Whitechapel Road and rolled after him all the way to the forest. He was reputed to be able to keep candles burning for weeks. When short of fuel, he conjured it up to the sound of ram's horn trumpets. Kabbalistic incantations also enabled him to conjure up food, wine, and other necessities. Falk held court in his house in regal splendor, wearing a golden turban, and people deemed it an honor to bring him donations. When he went out, he wore a long robe, which, with his beard, gave the impression of nobility. His tombstone claims that he uplifted the banner of the Torah, though others accuse him of heresy. He gave charity generously. Some say that he lost fortunes as well as making them. He was close to several members of the Western Synagogue. His admirers included Gentiles. He gave Philippe, Duke of Orleans, a talisman. His friend Baron Theodore de Neuhoff was briefly king of Corsica. Some leading Freemasons may have had associations with him. At this time, what is called speculative Freemasonry was developing, and amongst its proponents were members of the Royal Society. Unlike the Hasidic Baal Shem Tov, master of the good name, Falk is not known to have brought ordinary Jews closer to God and Judaism. He may have been an observant Jew, but Rabbi Jacob Emden of Altona accused him of being a follower of Shabtai Tzvi and having Sabbatean friends. Emden said that Falk was not a Baal Shem, but a Baal Shed, master of the demon. Emden was critical of alchemy, unlike his antagonist Rabbi Jonathan Eibeshutz. Chaim Yitzchak David Azulai accused Falk of being a charlatan and believed that he gave rich people a smattering of the Kabbalah for the sake of financial reward. Because Falk could afford a printing press, he produced polemical publications which inflamed the controversies of the time. His own notes and the diary compiled by his son-in-law and secretary Tzvi Hirsch Kalish are too cryptic to allow a conclusive answer as to how learned or genuine Falk was. Chief Rabbi Herman Adler, in a 1903 essay, grants that Falk preyed on the superstitious and failed to rise above his circumstances to become a truly holy man. On the one hand, in an age of emergent scientific experiment, Falk probably deserves more credit for his alchemy than his theology. And whilst his eccentricity was evident, he might even be counted amongst the pioneering figures in British science. On the other hand, his critics might be justified in the light of the biblical warnings against magic and sorcery. Falk's combination of Kabbalah and chemistry, wrapped in theatrics, puts his integrity and piety in doubt. He lived in England for 40 years and died in April 1782. Not much is known about his personal life, though he left descendants as well as charitable bequests. Cecil Roth's wife Irene had a family connection with both Falk and Kalish. Now, Joseph Cruel, C-R-O-O-L. Strangest of the early 19th century British Jews was Rabbi, in inverted commas, Joseph Cruel, called an eccentric travelling scholar of Hungarian origin, a man of great pretensions and little learning. His eccentricities are widely mentioned. The Jewish Chronicle of 30 June 1848 reprints from the Cambridge Independent Press a letter from Reverend F.R. Hall of Fulbourn, who asks, "Who was Mr. Cruel?" He was a Jew who gave Hebrew lessons to a few fellows of colleges in the University of Cambridge, when for several years the royal professors of Hebrew were absentees. And instead of giving 20 lectures in the year, according to the custom of most professors of the university now, never gave one and never offered to do so. Mr. Krull was by no means a learned man. He was not well read, and he could read no language except English, German, and Hebrew. He was not a man of good sense. He abounded in prejudices. He delighted in old wives' fables and vain traditions. He supposed that it was the angel Gabriel who appeared to the fathers and prophets of the Jews. He wore a parchment girdle on which were inscribed passages from the law and the Talmud. He believed that Christ did not yet come because of the sins of the Jews. He cared not for the prophecies concerning the Messiah in the book of Daniel. He thought that Christ would come into the world in a state of manhood, and that he would reign from Jerusalem to the ends of the world, the conqueror and the king of all the enemies of the Jews. Well, this is the rather unkind judgment of Reverend F.R. Hall, whoever he happened to be, writing in the Cambridge Independent Press. Perhaps Krull had tried to teach Hall Hebrew, and the two did not get on well. But Hall's remarks are almost as strange as his assertions about Krull. He may be right that the latter lacked rabbinic ordination, but how? How can he be so sure? Krull was certainly more learned than Hall admits. His use of biblical and midrashic material may be idiosyncratic, but it is impressive. Krull is not likely to have had a university education, but he must have known enough Hebrew to satisfy his Cambridge employers. Stephen Reif has written, "Given that those who were religiously acceptable as officially appointed Hebrew teachers were not always linguistically qualified to perform such a function, locally available Jews could be drafted in on a paid but informal basis to educate the students in the Holy Tongue." What Hall means by old wives' fables we do not know. Perhaps it's midrashim about Messiah. Hall thinks Krull did not know many languages, but surely he spoke Yiddish and presumably Hungarian. Even the description of Krull's personal habits is strange. If he wore a parchment girdle containing Hebrew quotations, it may have been tefillin, prayer boxes, which Orthodox Jewish men fasten with leather straps to their forehead and arm before morning prayers. Hall may also not have completely understood Krull's views of Judaism or Christianity. Krull did not deny the sins of the Jews, but he thought the Jews were more sinned against than sinning. He wanted Christians to reassess their view of the Jews, because the world had little time left. It didn't bother him that Judaism was wary of his eschatological predictions. He said in 1829, "By a particular calculation of my own, it appears to me that the following 10 years will produce strange things in the world, and it further appears that all things will be accomplished by the year 5600 of the creation of the world, i.e. 1840. 1840, however, came and went, and the end of days did not arrive." Hall said he was opposed to the emancipation of the Jews because he thought that the introduction of Jews to Christian gentlemen in the legislature would lead to their conversion to the Christian faith. To reason with him was impossible. Does this mean that Hall himself favored Jewish emancipation? It could be so, but like a number of Christian advocates of the cause, he may have had an ulterior motive to bring the Jews into Parliament and thus hasten their acceptance of Christianity, which is precisely what Krull feared. The opponents of emancipation used Krull as proof that the Jews themselves were divided. Francis Henry Goldsmith wrote in 1830, "There's a certain small number of Jews who regard our application for relief not only with indifference, but even with doubt and distrust, because they imagine that its success is likely to promote amongst those who now adhere to Judaism a falling off from the faith of their ancestors. These persons maintain that the religious feeling of men arms them sufficiently against fear of the privations which restrictive laws impose, but that there is no such defense against the slow undermining progress of kindness and affection. Goldsmith believed that Jews did not need to be separate, but could enter Parliament without detriment to their religion. In biblical times, he said, Nehemiah and Daniel were ministers and servants of Babylonian kings. He also warned against predictions based on Kabbalistic fancies. Most Jews ignored Krul's speculations and opposed his views on emancipation. When the Bishop of Oxford mentioned Krul in the House of Lords, Paul retorted, his lordship's quotation from Mr. not Rabbi Krul in support of his opinion only serves to weaken it. The opinion in question is so much at variance with facts that it defeats the object of its advocate. What seems to have destroyed Krul's credibility was the non-fulfillment of his dream about 1840. Never highly regarded by either Jews or Christians, he was now merely a curiosity. We're not certain as to his date of death. Hall speaks of him in 1848 in the past tense. After quasi-ministerial activity in Manchester and Nottingham, Krul moved to Cambridge. There he worked and possibly resided for at least 20 years, but probably held no office in the Jewish community. He was succeeded as Preceptor Linguae Sacrae in 1837 by Herman Bernard, son of a converted Jew. Roth says, the earliest known officiant to the Manchester community was apparently that curious peripatetic scholar and pamphleteer Joseph Krul. His incumbency did not last long. Whether he was an official incumbent is not known. In 1802, he established a Hebrew academy at his home in Oak Street, Manchester. A sermon he gave in Manchester was titled Service of the Synagogue of the Jews at Manchester on March 8, 1803, being the day appointed for a general fast, delivered in Hebrew by Rabbi Joseph Krul and translated by him into English. We wonder how many of his listeners understood a Hebrew sermon. Krul used the occasion of this publication to make an appeal. Rabbi Joseph Krul, he said, respectfully informs the public that he has intended for a considerable time to publish in translation and explanation of all the difficult passages in the Old Testament. If any person would step forward to encourage him by bearing part of the expense with him, he thinks it would be of great service to the public. Well, you understand now why I said at the beginning, I leave it to you to judge how genuine these particular eccentric rabbis were. We move to Rabbi number 3, Abraham Belais, B-E-L-A-I-S. Whilst never holding office as Chacham, the Sephardi Rabbi Avraham ben Shalom Belais, 1773 to 1853, was an author in several languages and occasionally preached in English, often called upon for memorial addresses. One of his books, issued with English translation, was welcomed by the Jewish Chronicle as a boon to, quote, the traveller through a desert parched with the drought and languishing with thirst. Belais was a colourful character who had been a rabbi in Tunis and treasurer to the Bay. To escape his creditors, he moved to Jerusalem and started collecting funds for himself in Europe. Carrying recommendations from public figures in Italy, France, etc., he was a candidate for a post at the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam, and for some years was a rabbi in Nice. In 1840 he came to London with letters of introduction to the Duke of Sussex, who was a Hebraic scholar, and to the Dowager Queen Adelaide. He taught in the Sephardi Congregational School, occasionally sat on the Sephardi Bet Din, and gave memorial addresses and occasional theological discourses. But his financial troubles continued, and he needed constant support from the synagogue charities. The congregational leaders, determined to control everything in the community, objected to his publishing a book of poems without their permission in 1841, and in 1843 they declined to sponsor another book he had written. From 1844 to 1853, he was a member of Etz Chaim, the synagogue's yeshiva. The title page of his Perach Shoshan Beit Levi says, "The light of his Torah shines in the Etz Chaim College for Torah study of the Sephardi congregation." He was no cloistered scholar, but threw himself into controversy. When the Jewish Chronicle saw that the community favored the repeal of the cherem, ban, against the group who had established the Reform congregation, Belias supported the repeal against the stricter view of the official Sephardi Dayanim, David Meldola and Abraham Chaliva. Belias said the cherem could be repealed by the Board of Elders without the Bet Din. The elders decided not to submit Belias' views to the rabbis of Leghorn and Amsterdam, as this would cast doubt on the credibility of Meldola and Chaliva. Belias wrote poetry, eulogies, and works on ethics and exegesis. His Petach HaBayit, a commentary on the Rabbinic Code, the Torah, was published in 1846, together, quote, with answers in reference to congregational questions in London, plus Pri Etz Chaim, 7 funeral orations. His Afrot Tevel, 1850, is a commentary on ecclesiastics in Hebrew and English. He wrote odes, including one in Hebrew and English, on a Rothschild family wedding. The Adler collection in New York contains a bound volume of Prayers and Thanksgivings 1756 to 1885, which includes a poem by Belias in honor of the marriage of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert 1840, and an elegy dated 1843 for the Duke of Sussex. His Sefer Perach Shoshan Beit Levi is titled in English Biblical Expositions, printed for and to be had of the author of 46 Great Prescott Street. The Hebrew title reflects the fact that a patron of the work was Shmuel Levi ben Susan, or ben Sassoon. The translation is stated as by the same learned professor who is expected to translate Belias' work on Ecclesiastes. The learned professor may have been Hyman Horowitz, professor of Hebrew at University College London, who died in 1844 and presumably did not complete the work. Horowitz himself was no preacher, oratory, as an obituary note remarks, not being one of his shining qualifications. However, his written English style was quite fluent and elegant. The Jewish Chronicle criticized the translation of Belias' work. It said, "We do not look for elegance in the Hebrew or in its English translation, the latter of which must have been a laborious task." Nor did the paper think the work showed much originality. It said, "We waive, W-A-V-E, all reflections about originality of matter, but it praised the fourth section, which seeks biblical evidence for life after death." An advertisement at the beginning of the book assures readers, in terms familiar in halachic works, that whenever the author uses the words goy or akum, he means heathens and idolaters, not Christians, since the latter are brothers and Jews pray for their welfare. Belias adds, "It is particularly incumbent upon us to wish well to the government of countries in which we enjoy freedom and liberty to follow our sacred religion, like in England, under the reign of our blessed Queen Victoria." Now, eccentric Rabbi number 4, Herman Hoelzel, Hoelzel. Nathan Marcus Adler was elected as chief rabbi largely because of the support of the Duke of Cambridge. Adler, an experienced ecclesiastical administrator, determined that his writ would run throughout the proud British Empire. Apart from Adler, the other clergy, even the handful with rabbinic learning, were known by the British nomenclature of the Reverend, deferring to a chief rabbi who was the Jewish equivalent of the Archbishop of Canterbury. The critics dubbed Adler a chief without Indians and mocked what they called Adlerism. Not that the chief was without his challenges. Apart from the nonconformist ethos represented by David W. Marks, founding minister of the new established Reform congregation, Adler faced and overcame the ambitions of two rabbinic rivals, Hermann Hölzel, nominally reader of the Hamburg Synagogue, and Solomon Schiller Schinnessy of Manchester, whose affections moved from orthodoxy to reform. Both Schiller and Hölzel were colourful and significant figures, but I want to focus on the ambitions and activities of Hölzel. Hölzel's background is not entirely clear. He claimed a continental doctorate which may not have been genuine, as well as the title of Moreno, our teacher, bestowed by various European rabbis and endorsed by Rabbi Moses Sofer of Presburg. This does not necessarily mean a rabbinical diploma. In some places, the Moreno title was granted when a student got engaged or married. Born in Budapest in 1812, Hölzel was Chazan in Magdeburg, Germany from 1836 to 40, and then gained a similar appointment in Hanover where Nathan Marcus Adler was rabbi. He moved to England in 1845 and served the Hamburg Synagogue as reader and occasional preacher from 1845 to 52. His first sermon was in October 1850, when the Jewish Chronicle asked the community to be patient with a preacher's inadequate English diction. Like Samuel Marcus Gollancz, his successor from 1855 to 1900, Hölzel was nominally reader, but fulfilled regular ministerial functions. There was not yet a clear distinction between Chazan and minister. This came later. Hölzel's sermons at the Hamburg were apparently rather colourful and dramatic, and sometimes regarded as hindering the emancipation movement. At this stage, Hölzel might have been on good terms with Adler, but the latter's authority as chief rabbi was bound to cramp Hölzel's own ambitions. Adler examined him in Hebrew, Bible commentaries, and rabbinic knowledge, and confirmed that he was qualified to be a minister. This aided Hölzel, but it spelled trouble for Adler, whose plan to be the empire's highest rabbinic figure was well known. Hölzel held the ambition, presumably not revealed to Adler, of holding an equivalent position in the Antipodes. Aware that Sydney and Hobart were interested in Hölzel as minister, Adler recommended him, provided he referred any major decisions to London. Nonetheless, Hölzel represented himself, probably on his own initiative, as authorized by Adler to act on a higher and more independent rabbinic level. When he arrived in Australia, Hölzel informed his congregants that Adler had appointed him to be the presiding rabbi of the Australian colonies, whatever the grandiloquent title meant. He certainly had a high opinion of himself. Adler would have recognized that the Hamburg, for all its communal cachet, could not contain Hölzel, but probably neither Australia or Adler himself realized the extent of Hölzel's pretensions. With wisdom after the event, we have to view Hölzel as planning to bypass the chief rabbi and be the Adler of Australia. Hölzel was the son of Rabbi Judah Semnitz, second rabbi, presumably Dayan, of Althofen, namely Buda in Hungary. Semnitz is from a Hungarian town. Hermann himself used the name Hölzel, which means little wood. He had a strong personality, musical voice, and Jewish knowledge. His foreign accent probably worried the Australian Synagogue Committee. He was not the only applicant for the Sydney position, but he seemed the best qualified. But precious time was lost when the London Committee charged with dealing with applications had misgivings, which needed to be cleared with Sydney. The problem centred on, quote, scholastic, i.e. secular, acquirements, which suggests that Hurlsel could not have had a genuine doctorate. The London Committee felt that any decision should be made in Sydney. It took months for letters to go to and fro between England and Australia. Sydney eventually decided in 1852 to appoint Hurlsel, but the whole process took many months, and in the meantime neither Hurlsel nor Adler thought anything would happen with the Sydney position, so Adler sanctioned Hurlsel's appointment to Hobart instead. When a letter from Sydney reached London, it was too late. Hurlsel was already en route to Hobart, so despite Sydney's annoyance, they missed out on him, at least at that stage. He did later go to Sydney, not that the shidduch was a great success, but at this stage they were upstaged. The first that Sydney heard of it was when Hobart wrote to say they'd engaged Hurlsel, who duly arrived in Tasmania on the sailing ship Abberton with his wife Minna, they had no children, on 22nd May 1853, immediately declaring himself presiding Rabbi of the Australian colonies. Sydney resented the way it had been treated and declined to place itself under Hurlsel's jurisdiction, intending to appoint its own chief rabbi. It rankled that Hurlsel's title had seemingly been approved by London. A protest was sent to Adler, who replied diplomatically that because of the delays, Hurlsel and he had felt that no Sydney appointment was likely to eventuate, so he had nominated Hurlsel for Hobart. Adler presumed that Hurlsel would function under his aegis, but Hurlsel had his own ideas. Adler confirmed Hurlsel's suitability for, quote, the ministry in question, but repeated that he be pledged to submit all complicated and difficult theological questions to higher authority. Hurlsel had his own view of what Adler called complicated and difficult theological questions, and saw himself as the higher authority, even though when he wrote to Sydney he spoke only of the honour of becoming your minister. When Hobart wrote to Sydney in June 1853, they claimed that the Reverend Dr. N.M. Adler, Chief Rabbi of the Jews of the British Empire, has been pleased to nominate and appoint the Reverend Herman Hurlsel, who has recently arrived in this city, to be the presiding rabbi in the Australian colonies, with full power and authority to adjudicate in all religious matters. Hobart had swallowed whatever Hurlsel had told them. The Jewish Chronicle reported on 11th February 1853 on his energy and perseverance. His Hobart induction took place on 5th June in a full synagogue, conducted by the second reader with choir and orchestra. Hurlsel was conducted to his seat under a velvet canopy. The collection amounted to an impressive £150. He soon set up his own Beth Din in conjunction with Henry Jones, the second reader, and on 29th January 1854 conducted the divorce of Michael and Sarah Solomons. The husband was in jail at the time for stealing from his mother-in-law. Presumably Hurlsel was a competent preacher and speaker. He was certainly cultured, even though the selection committee in London had doubted his competency in secular subjects. He made contact with the Royal Society in Hobart and gave lectures to the general public. He was the most significant, most highly qualified minister the Hobart community ever had, but his incumbency lasted only 3 years. By 1856, he had fallen out with the congregation and once more approached Sydney. This time the negotiations reached finality thanks to the relative ease of communication. Hurlsel moved to Sydney, again with the title of Presiding Rabbi of the Australian Colonies. At first the congregation went along with his grand title, which brought them public status. But when he claimed control over Melbourne, the local congregation objected to his pretensions and opposed his conducting conversions and divorces without consulting or deferring to Adler, who by now must have been distressed at Hurlsel's perfidy. In Sydney, as in Hobart, Hurlsel gave public lectures on music and literature. Then matters became serious. Apart from conflicts on liturgical and financial matters, the board were alarmed at his and his wife's support for the maverick artist Samuel Elyard, who claimed to be King of Australia, Prince of Israel, and Elijah incarnate. Elyard wanted to turn the Jews of Sydney into Christians and sought permission to preach in the York Street Synagogue. The board regarded Elyard as dangerous and were perturbed at Hurlsell's apparent sympathy for the artist. They told the rabbi that if he resigned his post, they'd pay his and his wife's fares to England plus 6 months' salary. When the Hurlsells left, they told people they were returning to England. Hurlsell does not figure in the subsequent history of the British rabbinate. Presumably Adler breathed a sigh of relief once a possibly unexpected challenge to his own imperial policy was over. Hurlsell might have made for England in the first instance, but he went, perhaps soon afterwards, to the continent, where he died in Vienna in February 1886, having embarked on a business career. Whether he also functioned as a cantor or rabbi is not certain. Ladies and gentlemen, those are my 4 eccentric rabbis. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Rabbi Apple for that. Before I open this to questions, can you just clarify, the person who opened Rabbi Falk's papers died on the spot. Has anybody else dared to look at it since?
That story is one of the strange, possibly apocryphal stories which are part of Anglo-Jewish folklore. One really isn't certain whether it ever happened, but people were so superstitious in those days that if somebody dropped dead, no one else was ever going to try to investigate the whole circumstances.
Okay, anybody like to ask a question or two of the...
Rabbi Apple, would you say there's something about the rabbinical position, or the way it's understood, which actually engenders eccentricity or things of this kind? I mean, is it sort of a built-in kind of thing? Especially in Manchester.
Are you speaking from personal experience?
Obviously, it's different jobs, different roles do have their own consequences, you might say.
You see, there is a big problem because very often it happens that a minister, a rabbi, whatever the title might be, feels very disappointed in life. The rabbi dedicates himself to a set of beliefs and practices which many in the congregation really don't take nearly as seriously as he does. So the rabbi feels a little bit hurt. The result is that very often the rabbi turns into a person who makes himself into almost a hero type, as if to say, congregation, you really don't appreciate who I am and what I have. And the more that the rabbi turns himself into a hero type, I hesitate, of course, to say a quasi-messiah, the more eccentric he becomes. You see, I don't need to tell anyone who's ever been in the rabbinic profession that there is hardly a rabbi who doesn't have mannerisms which in some ways are very peculiar. Against myself, I can tell the story that after I'd been at the Great Synagogue in Sydney for 30 years, it was decided that there ought to be, that my portrait ought to be painted so that I could be, what's the word, hung or hanged in the synagogue precincts. So, I don't quite know how it is, but the artist must have been told by somebody that there are certain typical poses of mine, such as that. And so he painted me looking like that. And if you don't believe it, well, we actually have a photographic copy of that portrait sitting in our lounge room in Yerushalayim. Now, I know other rabbis who wouldn't smoke on Shabbat, God forbid, but on weekdays would take a cigarette and never flick off the ash, so that people would be mesmerized watching to see what was going to happen. There are all sorts of things. There are certain rabbis who make a fetish of the size or the shape of their beard and so on and so forth. Now, whether that means that these rabbis can be regarded as eccentric, well, it's a matter of judgment. Whether it means that I am not particularly encouraging anyone to enter the rabbinic profession, well, I don't know. You see, when I look around, I suspect that most people present are not of the age at which they would consider entering the ministry from the bottom. Just one further thing. Of these rabbis that I've mentioned, only one actually occupied a congregational position. So I'm using the term rabbi in a broader sense, and not necessarily only in the sense of a congregational minister.
Anybody else got a question? Yes, Rabbi Wolf.
Halachic, when he gave forgetting, was that accepted, or were like you have the great grandchildren, were they considered she married again, Mamzerim? I mean, you would have that question that somebody rabbis that gave a get 100 years previously, was the get a kosher get, or are the gears a kosher gears?
I have to tell you, it is a real problem, and in the course of all the years I spent in the rabbinate in Australia, there were many times when I really wasn't certain whether to accept as valid a conversion or a get which had taken place in Australia in those very early days. And I'm still not certain. In more recent years, we know that, particularly in Melbourne and Sydney, there were unqualified and unrecognized people who, on their own authority, would act as their own bet din, would act as shochtim, and so on and so forth, and an immense amount of problems arose as a result. So I don't know the answer to your question, but all I can say is that if one wanted to try to uncover all the circumstances behind a particular conversion or get that happened in the early 19th century, then one might disturb the proverbial hornet's nest, but there is a problem.
Mr. Joseph.
I can tell you a few more.
I'm sure. Has anybody got anything else? I was always interested in the first rabbi in Edinburgh was described as a controversialist. I presume that would come under the banner of eccentricity, and moved on after a year. I'm sure the
Is that Rintel?
Mayor Rintel.
Yeah.
You come across him?
Oh, yes. Do you want to make a comment?
If you have information.
Yes. Okay. We have to go back to about 1817 or something.
Exactly so.
When Chief Rabbi Solomon Herschel in London was being bitterly attacked, whether rightly or wrongly is for another time, but one of his opponents wrote a very nasty tract setting out all the sins or the supposed sins that the chief rabbi had committed. In the chief rabbi's defense, a booklet was written by a man called Meir or Maya Rintel, who apparently was a poultry shochet in London at the time. I actually, some time ago, was able to acquire a copy of Rintel's booklet, and one of these days, if the Almighty gives me time and health, I want to translate it into English and try and write something about the background. Rintel disappeared from London very soon afterwards. There are various views as to whether he went directly from London to Edinburgh or whether he went to the continent for a while. The story is a little bit murky. He apparently was not a very peaceful or peaceable person, and the fact that he didn't last in Edinburgh for very long is to be expected, particularly when you consider that his son, Moses Rintel, eventually ended up in Sydney and then later in Melbourne as a schoolmaster and minister, and was also a highly controversial character with great admirers and great enemies. The story of Moses Rintel in some ways echoes the story of his father Meir. Moses was lucky in that he married a woman from a wealthy family, and this helped him to establish a position in the community. I know this doesn't bear so much on the Edinburgh story, but we know that there was a big controversy in Melbourne at one particular stage when there was a split in the community, and Rintel moved to the opposition shul, and then he and the minister of the establishment shul both regarded themselves as the senior minister of the community, and both congregations contacted the government in order to inform the government that their particular minister was the one that the government should deal with, and the matter was referred to London, and all sorts of things happened. But the story of Mayor Rintel, as I say, one day I will work on, and I hope its Edinburgh chapter can be discussed with you. Thank you.
Okay. If there are no more questions, before I ask Gabriel to give the vote of thanks, I've noticed that people have been sort of rushing off a bit during the vote of thanks. I want to make a couple of announcements before that. To say that the next meeting of the Society will be on March the 7th, when yours truly will be the speaker, and I will be talking about Jews and Poles in Britain during the Second World War, particularly related to the Polish army. 30,000 ethnic Poles in the Polish army were present in Britain during the war, and of these about 1,000 were Jewish, mostly based in army units around Scotland, and by about 1943-44 there were major desertions from the Polish army, and questions were asked in Parliament about anti-Semitism and so on. It's a fascinating story, and I'll tell you about it if you come back to the next meeting. On Wednesday of next week, there is another meeting which I'm involved, shared with the International Institute for Jewish Genealogy, and its chairman, Neville Lamdan, will be speaking about the Institute's plans to organise the movement, a new dimension in Jewish genealogy, moving from the original outlook of concentrating on individuals and their story, and then to individual towns or Städtlach and their story, to create a study of a national community. And the International Institute chose Scotland for a number of reasons. First of all, the size, and the fact that it has a well-established archive centre. And so there will be a meeting on Wednesday of next week in the Hatzvi Synagogue in Rehov Hovevit Zion, at which this programme, starting from the International Institute and leading to a new book which I've recently completed, which tells how this story of a national community on a complete demographic and genealogical basis has been conducted. There will be circulars about both events from our publicity officer over the next few days. I would now like to call on our chairman, Gabriel Sivan, to give a vote of thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Could you come to the front, because as this is all being recorded for posterity, we wouldn't like to have a disembodied voice giving the vote of thanks.
I can see Leslie wants to put me on the camera. Before I do so, I'd like to make a couple of comments. I restrained myself from trying to add to the questions from the audience. There are a couple of things I wanted to say. First of all, it's about Eccentrics. You mentioned the fact, Raymond, that Mrs. Cecil Roth claimed descent from, I remember her telling us about this at Oxford, from the Baal Shem of London. The fact is, anybody who knew Irene would say that she was also quite an eccentric. The other thing is that I'm hoping that maybe on a future occasion when you do a second round, you'll include a certain Reverend, what was his name, Hochman, something like that?
Yeah.
The gentleman who I think was the minister of the New West End Synagogue, who made a practice of going on horseback from Rotten Row to his synagogue to attend the Mikvah service, among other things. He also, as far as I remember, started out as a doughty opponent of reform and then proceeded to suggest some of his own. Right, I'll get back down to the business. It's now almost 7 years since it was last my pleasant duty to move a vote of thanks to our speaker, Rabbi Raymond, and that was in May 2010. When we both arrived at Jewish College nearly 6 decades ago, he came as an Australian university graduate who had served in the armed forces down under, while I had a first degree from Oxford after performing my national service in the Royal Air Force. We both married in England, but our paths diverged as Raymond was awarded smicha, proceeded to distinguish himself as a United Synagogue minister in London, and as we've heard, as the senior rabbi of Sydney's Great Synagogue. Many of his publications reflect his time in the United Kingdom. They deal with Anglo-Jewish history, synagogues, reverend gentlemen, and those outward usages known as Minhag Anglia. Tonight's subject clearly falls into that particular category, and not surprisingly, it has provided us with entertainment as well as instruction. Now supposedly retired here in Jerusalem, Rabbi Apple keeps busy as an author, lecturer, and expounder of Torah. He contributes to Jewish Bible scholarship and historical research while retaining his links with Australian Jewry and his devotion to modern orthodoxy through the offices we've heard that he holds in the Rabbinical Council of America. Nor should we overlook the supporting role of Rabbanit Marian Apple in all of these activities. We appreciate his work for the Jewish Historical Society of England's Israel branch, and also, by the way, we appreciate the Apple's continued readiness to host our committee meetings. It therefore gives me great pleasure to propose this vote of thanks, which I'm sure will have your enthusiastic approval.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. And it only remains for me to say that copies of Rabbi Apple's books are on sale for those who didn't manage to get a copy before the meeting started. So please, if you're ready to part with 50 shekels, do so now.